If you don't know much about voodoo, then typically when I say these words, they inherit, images that are similar to maybe this. But not a lot of people understand that voodoo has a deeply rooted history in the Haitian people as well as the African people, and all and many people throughout the African diaspora. And when I say African diaspora, I don't mean the current diaspora of just people who migrate from Africa. I'm talking about the people who were taken during the period of colonization and brought over to the New World all across the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere. Now, to really understand the way that Christianity and Vodou have intermingled, you need to know a little bit more about the history. During the time of colonization, many of the slaves were connected to some kind of spiritual practice to some degree. And that spiritual practice typically it permeated itself within many aspects of their personal lives, through the rituals, the coming of age rituals, for example, or the way that elders were chosen, depending on the tribe you were in, or even the way that political figures within your tribe were chosen, and then how they kept their seat. They create the way of life that many people within Africa had lived before colonization. So once they got taken away, and the Christian faith, the Protestant faith, and the Catholic faith were kind of just being forced upon them, then that created the process of synchronism. Typically, if something is so deeply rooted into who you are, it's obviously going to be very hard to get rid of that. It's not going to be so easy just to involve yourself in this new faith. And that's what the slaves found. And so they kind of started meshing things together. So that's the process of synchronism. When two religions come together, intermingling and creating a new way of practice that was influenced by those two or more faiths. Now, if you take a look behind me, you'll see that I do have Catholic saints here, but they actually represent Vodou spirits that I honor within my practice. This is exactly what the slaves did. They basically found the saint that was most like the spirit that they wanted to work with, and that was how they decided that they were going to acknowledge them. And over time, they stripped away traditional ways of practicing because they could only have access to what they had access to on that plantation or in the geography of wherever the area that they landed in. Now, when you think about Haitian Vodou, typically we have three main influences, three main parents, as I like to call them. Essentially, these three parents were the Tainos that lived on the island before Christopher Columbus got there. Their influence isn't as strong because a lot of them had died off by the time the Africans had, force migrated there. And a lot of their teachings didn't really survive as well on the Haitian side of the island. But there is still influence there. The Christian faith, and that is just a banner for the Catholics, the Protestants, whatever, that were forcing the religion and trying to convert the new slaves, as well as those old African practices. Now, these practices come across a whole region of Africa because people were purposefully intermingled with different tribes from different places. And all of that comes to be in a situation where, because they were kind of forced into Christianity, there are many Vodouisants that have adopted the teachings of Jesus Christ. There are many Vodouisants that have adopted Christian ideology. And all of that is to say that depending on who you are, the way that the Bible has been interpreted might change. We all know there are about 1,000 denominations within the Christian faith as a result of the varying interpretations that can happen when we are reading the Bible, regardless of what aspect of, regardless of what denomination you cling to. When you really think about the history of how Vodou and Christianity kind of developed on the island of Haiti, you can get a sense that in a ways the way that a lot of Haitians think of Christianity are it's almost like a new denomination. It's almost like a new teaching and a new development within the faith itself. But it's kind of controversial because the way that people think about Vodou put us in a position where it's hard for people to accept that something like Vodou could possibly intermingle with Christianity in any other way. most of the time, if you're atheist or agnostic or you don't know much about the ensuing religions, and you see these Vodouisans calling themselves Christian, you might get taken aback, because at its core, it doesn't seem to make sense. The idea of Christianity in the West is varied depending on who you ask. But one thing for sure, it has never been all that much congruent with the with Eastern or African traditions, until you go to a place like Haiti, where the African faiths have kind of passed down generation to generation and become the Vodou that we have today, and did that simultaneously to the development of Christianity on the island. And so just because it is, and then we have the Christians who absolutely do not want this at all. And I don't necessarily blame them. They don't want anything messing up their faith. Most variation when it comes to Christianity isn't looked, it's kind of looked down upon. Most Christians, from what I've seen, might branch off into another Christian faith, but there are very definitive parameters that you set yourself into as a Christian to define your Christianity. And most of the time, variation is not welcome, or any kind of change in interpretation that's too radical typically doesn't do well within the community of Christianity. And so there's been a movement in some ways. Even there have been movements to kind of stamp out the Christian intermingling. In the 70s or so, the Protestant church started a campaign to demonize Vodou and kind of blame them for the troubles that happened within Haiti. Going back to the Bois ceremony from a couple hundred years prior to that, which I'll talk about in another video. And essentially at the time, Catholicism was very much synchronized to Vodou. It was more of like a don't ask, don't tell situation. If you were a Vodou practitioner during that time, as long as you kept it under wraps, secret, you go to your ceremony on Saturday, but you're in church on Sunday morning, they didn't really ask too many questions. And then the Protestant church came in and essentially decided that they were going to stop this completely. They were going to begin the transition of trying to sort of eradicate the sentiment that existed around Vodou and the acceptance of this secretive nature of Vodou in that way. And so we went from demonized to, honoring it again through the revolution, using it as a means to free ourselves, then demonizing it again when things didn't go so well, because it is such a quintessentially Black faith. It is such a quintessentially African faith. And so the closer you were to that, the, I suppose, more threatening you were to the ensuing powers throughout colonization. And this sentiment just kind of passed down over and over and over again. It is essentially racist, when you think about it. But I don't want to say that the Protestant church were racist for doing it, for their campaign in the 70s. It's primarily just it's primarily just what I called frenzied faith. Their inability to listen, and then using propaganda as a means to demonize Vodou. This frenzied faith created a situation where, for decades, it was difficult to talk, acknowledge, think, or learn about Vodou within Haiti, even though decades prior, it had become something that you could gain access to, even if it wasn't the most well-accepted practice, depending on where you lived in Haiti. And so, over and over again, time and again, we have Vodou kind of shifting and changing depending on the people and the places that they practice it. What you need to remember is that faith, in a lot of ways, is interpretive. Not all Vodouisans think alike, act alike, and do alike. And that's the same exact situation for Christians. And so the fact that these two faiths exist together is honestly, I think it's kind of interesting and funny because a lot of Christians will demonize Vodouism for calling themselves Christians or for acting like Christians or anything, but their predecessors are the ones who forced it upon the African slaves, and it created the system of synchronism that we have today. And there's also a campaign of Vodouism who don't want to be associated with Christianity whatsoever because of all the harm that it's done to the community and all the harm that it's done to the perspective that people have on Vodou, as well as changing Vodou to kind of realign with our roots, with our African roots and our African traditions. And none of these campaigns to essentially go back to Africa with the faith and double down on the origin and kind of eschew the colonizer, influence. But the problem with synchronism is that we have lost a big part. Well, who knows how much, big, small, but we have definitely lost significant portions of the faith of the spiritual African practices, and we have supplemented it with elements of Christian faith. And so there are certain aspects of the religion that we can never get back. There are certain aspects of the religion that we got from Christians and Catholics that we will never be able to truly strip away. Haitian Vodou is in and of itself a brand new religion because of the history of Vodou. It cannot go back to purely being a African spiritual practice. It can't purely go back to the ways that they were practiced before colonization, because we don't have the history, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the teachings of them. We have only what we were passed down and what we've been able to capture and save throughout the last two or so centuries. And so it's a lot to think about. It is certainly something to acknowledge. And the history of Vodou and Christianity is one that's very intermingled. And so who are any of us to judge a practitioner for practicing the way that they see fit? If they are not hurting anyone, if nothing bad is happening in the world, if, asteroids aren't falling on us, then I think we're going to be fine. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.